Susan is Director of CHPE, the Centre for Health Professions Education in the FMHS faculty, and her research is covering a range of topics related to learning and teaching in health professions, specifically focusing on strengthening postgrad studies, faculty development, and academic writing. Much of her work is informed by the principles of transformative learning theory. And in her current project, she intentionally looks to adopt a social justice agenda. Prof. Susan is an SU Teaching Fellow for the following 3 years and also a Fellow of the International Association of Medical Educationalists, better known as AME. At AME, Prof. Susan is a member of both the International AME Research and Faculty Development Committees and the chair of the AME Doctoral Report Award panel. She's also been a member of the editorial board of MedEd Publish and she's currently associate editor for the African Journal of Health Professions Education, Advances in Health Sciences Education, and the Clinical Teacher. She serves on the editorial advisory board of CRISTAL, the Journal for Critical Studies in Teaching and Learning. She's a founding member of the Bellagio Global Health Education Initiative and has served on the AME Aspire to Excellence International Board. She's a C-rated NRF researcher and has authored or co-authored more than 80 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and she's an honorary SAFRE Fellow. At SU, for the moment, she's working on an SU Teaching Fellowship for the next 3 years, and that engages her experience and expertise as mentor and supervisor for emerging scholars and young academics. She's currently leading a multi-institutional study about undergraduate curricula and their potential to deliver graduates who are both clinically competent and critically conscious of the contexts where they will work. In 2017, she received an SU Teaching Excellence Award in the category of Distinguished Teacher, and in 2018, she received the National Teaching Excellence Award of CHE and Haltasa. She will discuss 3 articles, which is strongly recommended for reading, and I will copy the link to those articles where you can click and download them easily in the chat function. And I will also ask you to complete the feedback form, and if not me, then Lucy will copy that for you in the chat function. So thank you for joining, and thank you for Prof. Susan for being here. Let me hand over to her.
Thank you, Gerda, and hi everyone. It's really great to be here and wonderful to see so many familiar names. I really want to acknowledge all my colleagues from the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, and also the many, many colleagues that I've come to know through the years at Stellenbosch University at large. So wonderful to see such a large group, and I hope we're going to have a fabulous conversation this afternoon. I'm going to switch off my video while I go through the presentation, and then I'll switch it on again later when we come to the Q&A. So yes, our title for today, Scholarship, Scholarly Teaching and SOTL. And I thought we might explore what these words which will be familiar to many, if not all of you, what they hold for us as the professoriate. And if the title seems a little bit austere, I'll explain where the idea of professoriate comes from in due course. I need to start off by thanking Gerda and the team for inviting me to present today, and also for all their support in arranging everything. And yes, just generally, I'm always reminded of what a wonderful opportunity these Auxin sessions are. And having been at the CTL when they started, it's wonderful to see how they've grown and continued through the years. Okay, so let's get going. I first have to start with a number of acknowledgements, as ever, with any endeavour. And I want to go way back to thank my former CTL colleagues, Nicoline, Hanli, Karen, and Francois Cellier, no longer at the CTL, with whom I started my scholarly journey way back when. And one of the articles that have been sort of put forward for today comes from that group of colleagues. I want to also acknowledge Brenda Leibovitz, who really shaped much of my scholarly thinking in those early days. And then finally, more currently, a group of authors with whom I've been working on an article that is now in press, redefining scholarship for health professions education. And my authors there, Jen Cleland from Singapore, Susan Jameson from Glasgow, Rashmi Kusakar from Maastricht in the Netherlands, Shubha Ramani at Harvard in the US, and Tim Wilkinson at the University of Otago in New Zealand. So I'm really, ek ploeg met 'n ander man se kalwers vandag, but together we have been on a very interesting journey. Okay, so now we need to think about achieving some definitional clarity. Because in our article, the Redefining Scholarship in Health Professions Education article, we have argued that scholarship is an integral aspect of academia. It informs the practice of individuals and the field, and is often used to inform career progression decisions and policies. I think we can all relate to this. I would argue that this makes it high stakes, and yet scholarship is a complex and often an ambiguous term that is often used differently across different contexts, and probably has specific complexity in the context of education, where the scholarship of teaching and learning has become part of the landscape, and where the scholarship, or SOTL, as it has become known, sits sometimes quite uncomfortably along educational research or scholarship. So while these terms and concepts are, as I said earlier, unlikely to be unfamiliar, a shared understanding of what we mean when we use them is possibly not going to come easy. Sorry, my slides seem to be wanting to move on of their own accord, so I'll have to keep an eye on that. So although finding definitional clarity might not necessarily be easy, it does remain important for us, at least from time to time, to re-engage the debate about these terms and track how they might have evolved in recent years. So I hope today that ultimately we will look to understand definitional clarity across a continuum of understandings of scholarship, one that is premised on notions of breadth and depth of scholarly endeavor. So in our search for clarity, let's start at home with the Stellenbosch University Teaching and Learning Policy, which states that quality teaching and learning should be informed by scholarship, and that the teaching role progresses from reflective practitioners to scholarly teachers, who then become teaching scholars, and ultimately, says the policy, leaderly teaching scholars. And we'll come back to that right at the end. According to the policy, reflective practitioners think deliberately and critically about their teaching practice, which they systematically review and document. Scholarly teachers additionally draw on educational literature to reflect on their teaching practices and professional growth, but they move beyond personal reflection to observation and peer review of their teaching. Now, if we take this forward, a key dimension of scholarly teachers is that they will move to share the results of their critical reflection, albeit informally and with a view to enhancing teaching in the particular context. And so scholarly university teachers are distinguished from reflective practitioners by actively engaging in SOTL with a view to researching and subsequently publishing on teaching practice. And this is where some of the ambiguity perhaps enters the discussion. What's happening with a scholarly teacher? Because the policy continues by saying that teaching scholars research their teaching practice and document their professional growth with a view to publishing their findings publicly and contributing to the body of teaching and learning knowledge. Work in this field can be regarded as adopting the mantle of educational research, and I pick up on this a little later. Just to close the loop, leaderly teaching scholars contribute to the body of teaching and learning knowledge through publication and providing leadership in the field, institutionally, nationally, and internationally. So what then is scholarship? Well, again, according to the policy, scholarship is considered as linking practice to theory and theory to practice, encapsulated by the dimensions of discovery, integration, application, and teaching. And what one can see here is a very specific focus on scholarship that has been adopted in the policy to support what the policy is saying. But the ideas of discovery, integration, application, and teaching, of course, come from probably one of the most seminal works relating to scholarship, specifically in the context of teaching, and that, of course, is the work of Ernest Boyer, who was at that point working within the Carnegie Foundation. And it is in 1990 that Boyer published his priorities for the professoriate. And there you see where I drew the idea for my title. And Boyer described 4 scholarship domains: that of discovery, which demonstrates commitment to knowledge for its own sake, but to follow in a disciplined fashion an investigation wherever it may lead. The scholarship of integration, which makes connections across disciplines, often educating non-specialists. The scholarship of application, which moves towards engagement in service activities tied to one's special field of knowledge. And finally, the scholarship of teaching, which described transmitting, but also transforming and extending knowledge. What then is SOTL? Well, according to the policy, the scholarship of teaching and learning and the body of knowledge underpinning it should inform both the professionalization of academics in their teaching role and the scholarship of their teaching practice. So while that tells us what it should do, it doesn't really give us a definition. And Hanli Ardendorf's work, which is also one of the articles that was recommended for pre-reading, already as back in 2011, just suggested that it's about using teaching and learning literature for reflection, for dialogue, but also for systematic inquiry into one's teaching. Now, the outcome of these inquiries, argue Cohen, Barton, and Fast, must be public, susceptible to critical review and evaluation, and accessible for use by other members of one's scholarly community. Put simply, scholarly teaching draws on the expertise of others, while SOTL contributes to the expertise of others. Although it is not always easy to determine a point at which informal sharing becomes public dissemination, and hence my suggestion that we perhaps think of these things as being along a continuum. So what we therefore see is an expanded understanding of SOTL that speaks to criteria of scholarship. And I offer this quote from Potter and Kustra, published in the same year as Hanli's article. The systematic study of teaching and learning using established or validated criteria of scholarship to understand how teaching, our beliefs, behaviors, attitudes, and values can maximize learning and/or develop a more accurate understanding of such learning, resulting in products that are publicly shared for critique and use by an appropriate community. And so we see the link back to theory and practice, practice and theory. So what are these criteria for scholarly activity? And indeed, how do we take the science forward in the context of SOTL? I first want to just quickly remind us about the scholarship part of the teaching and learning, because at a very basic level, a dictionary definition of scholarship speaks to academic study or achievement, learning at the highest level, knowledge acquired by study, the attainment of a scholar. So Diamond and colleagues have provided us with some criteria for such scholarly activity. It requires a high level of discipline-related expertise in the context of SOTL, higher education knowledge and expertise. To adopt a scholarly manner in that we set clear goals, prepare adequately, and select an appropriate methodology when we embark on research. Work and results are appropriately documented and disseminated with reflective critique, assessing the significance and considering what was learned, the so what that journal editors always look for. This work should have significance beyond the individual context, and this is really important. Our classrooms are our laboratories, our incubators, our experimental spaces, but our work needs to have significance beyond that. Our work should be breaking new ground, or at the very least be innovative. It should be able to be replicated or elaborated on. And as we've heard several times now, should be reviewed and judged to be meritorious by one's peers. And many of you in the room are experts and researchers in different disciplines away from SOTL. And I'm sure that all these criteria for scholarly activity still resonate with you. However, this is maybe where it starts to get sticky, and you're probably wondering about engaging in SOTL versus being part of your own disciplinary research network. And like the chameleon, the terms seem to adapt to whatever context they are being used in. Making things more problematic is the critique that has been lodged against SOTL in recent years. Malcolm Tite, former journal editor of Teaching in Higher Education, recently argued that in 30, 40 or 50 years' time, the scholarship of teaching and research, interesting that he added research there, will be little more than a historical footnote, scarcely remembered by anyone. And more recently, Larson and colleagues have suggested that the field of scholarship and of teaching and learning has resulted in work which is low in quality, lacks theorization, and often fails to draw on or acknowledge the substantial existing body of relevant literature on teaching in higher education. Now, these ideas, though recently published, are actually not new. In fact, when Hanlie Hardendorf published her Strangers in a Strange Land article 10 years ago, she too alluded to many of the negative perceptions related to the credibility of SOTL work and the implications that these held. In the Larson article, they identify a friction, for example, between educational research and SOTL, suggesting that the latter suggesting that while guardians of educational research argue that those engaged in SOTL would benefit from a better understanding, those engaged in SOTL suggest that education is too far removed from practice. And maybe just to correct myself there, the educational researchers argue that those engaged in SOTL would benefit from a better understanding of educational research theories and methods, while the SOTLites suggest that such research can be too far removed from practice. So where does this leave us? Us, the professoriate. Or maybe let's just remind ourselves why this conversation is important. And here I draw on an article published last year in which Brenda, shortly before her death, was involved, and hence the name in brackets there. But Ching and Martison, together with Brenda at the time, posited 4 suggestions as to why the conversation around SOTL is important to be maintained. And they argued that SOTL provides an intellectual nourishment for academics who engage in it. And those of you who know Brenda will know, I suspect those are her words. Academics are able to generate research from their teaching, and research is surely the currency with which we engage often in higher education. Engaging in SOTL affirms academics' professional identity. This was an interesting one. And their belief that they can make a contribution to students' well-being. And finally, SOTL is a source of professional development and adds to an emerging confidence in the teaching role. And perhaps this is a no-brainer, because surely we want to be drawing on a body of evidence when we make our teaching decisions. And so there is a potential trajectory for the scholarly journey, the progression that's described in the teaching and learning policy that I started with earlier. But there are caveats, that while all, we would argue, should be scholarly teachers, not all will look to become teaching scholars or engage with the full breadth of scholarship activities. And we explore this in greater detail in the article that we published in 2013 that I referred to earlier. So what does it take for those seeking the teaching scholar journey? There is a process for acquiring legitimacy, a process that takes time and effort, that the discipline-specific knowledge that characterizes sound SOTL and/or educational research will apply in the same way as Wendy Macmillan and I described in an article in which we tried to really understand the ideas of the border crossing or the strangers in a strange land from Hanley's article. In our article, we argued that scientific knowledge is always socially organized. And so discipline-specific knowledge is therefore used by professions to position themselves, to position both insiders and outsiders, and the discursive practices that are used to establish epistemic authority. So in other words, drawing on the discourses and the positioning that establishes the intention and the norms and values of the particular discipline, in this case, the scholarship of teaching and learning. So really it's about choices. Where are you in terms of SOTL? Where are you in terms of the trajectory that the university's teaching and learning policy sets out for us? Are you a tourist dipping your toe in the water? Perhaps you want to acquire residency, permanent residency, or maybe you go the whole hog and adopt citizenship. So what are the steps to legitimate participation? Well, rather in a fun way, I can argue that you must reflect on your status, tourist, resident, or citizen, which identity you will adopt. Perhaps get to know the lay of the land, learn the lingo, join the party. In the words of Leuven Wenger, engage, imagine, align. But perhaps more seriously, individuals also have to learn to know the field, argued Alba and Barnacle. This knowing will extend far beyond having a solid grasp of the repository of content knowledge, although this is also important. But it will encompass knowing how individuals acquire this legitimacy through increasing participation in the socio-cultural practices that define the community. Knowing, in this broad sense, will facilitate membership in SOTL and also gives those embarking on educational scholarship the confidence that they can put their hands on their hips, in the words of Kamler and Thompson, because they believe that they have come to a point where they have something worth saying, something that is constructed out of scholarship and which involves examining the work of authorities and building a case that is personally meaningful out of one's own work and one's own research. And there I draw on the work of Chrissy Bowie. As indicated earlier, there may be a dissonance between your experiences as tourist, resident, or citizen. Levels of knowing and knowledge in one's parent discipline may be very different from levels of knowing and knowledge in health, in SOTL. So some final thoughts. Consider your scope of influence. If we ask the question, SOTL to what end? And in the blurb for this Auxin session, I suggested that we would close thinking about what are the implications of these discussions for us? What are the implications of our policy for teaching and learning for our practice? Well, surely we would embark on SOTL to enhance that practice, but to also grow the science. And we often commiserate about the science of teaching and learning and the stature of teaching and learning, or sometimes even the absence thereof. But implicit in Boyer's categories of scholarship was the scope of influence, spanning the learners in front of you, your department, your institution, your local national context, and the global SOTL community of practice. And those of you who know me will know that I'm a teaching activist at heart. So let's take on a mantle of academic or educational leadership to influence the scholarship of teaching and learning at our institution. And I would argue, drawing on the words of Dubosky and Blake, that we are all educational leaders, irrespective of where we are on that trajectory described in our policy, because educational leaders have a commitment to pedagogy and an informed understanding of teaching and learning. They understand the university context and have a knowledge of curriculum design and the principles that underpin it. They have an understanding of student needs and on the way they learn. And the mere fact that all of you are in this session today suggests that if you are not ready to innovate, you are surely ready to take new strategies on board. Thank you, Nkosi, baie dankie, and there are some references.
Thank you, Susan. That was indeed very inspiring. Now, colleagues, is an opportunity for us to discuss, and I invite you to speak out or put your hand up or put your input in the chat function. Is there anybody at this stage who would like to start the chat? Okay, while we're waiting for a colleague to grab the mic, Prof. Susan, I really appreciated the way you ended on, oh, there's Marion. Let's go for Marion first. Thank you for your contribution, Marion. Let's hear you.
Susan, thank you very much for that. You explained things that have been lurking in the back of my head for a while, and you actually vocalized them and made them clear. And that is a real skill. I mean, I know you're a border crosser, I'm a border crosser. And sometimes just having the terminology and the process and just making terms clear and understanding the journey is so important. It's so important. So thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed that. And I followed every bit of it, which sometimes I have to say with educational things, I don't always. I go, what are they talking about? What does that mean? Anyway, so thank you. I really enjoyed it. And I think it's a very valuable contribution to our community. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. I appreciate that.
Yes, it's a very warm message. Thanks, Marianne. And I see Prof. Lana also saying, very inspiring. And then you raise a dilemma, and that's what we love to hear about. I think of Prof. Susan's slide with that sticky gecko. So, Prof. Lana, do you want to say over the mic, or would you like us to work with the chat? I see Susan is already reading your chat there.
Yeah, so I'm happy to respond to Lana, and I think Lana, it is absolutely the dilemma as to whether to focus on profession-specific research or education research, and I suppose it's about the extent to which you feel that you can marry the two. We all know how difficult it is to keep abreast of the literatures across different fields, and so I really do believe there's a choice. And it's a choice that has to be made intentionally, and that we also are very aware of, depending on the choice that we make, depending on where we situate ourselves on the continuum, that will influence the claims that we can make about the work that we're doing. And I don't think there's a right and a wrong. I think what's important is that there's an awareness, that we are very conscious of what it is that we are doing, and therefore the extent to which we can make claims. So often one hears, especially of younger colleagues, who are sort of trying to test the waters. They're perhaps adopting the tourist idea, and they're sort of building their own careers in a particular disciplinary space, but are also passionate about teaching, and so want to understand their teaching. And then often will say, but my work doesn't get published, it just gets desk rejections and no one wants to engage with it. And that's when we need to recognize, this is where my work is at, and this is where I want to take it forward. Recognizing that to really be a teaching scholar, you will need to understand the scholarly educational literature in the same way that you had understood the literature in your field to get your PhD or whatever the case may be. And what I hope the message that people will take home is that it doesn't matter, that the choice is yours, that we should all be asking questions about our teaching and drawing on our sphere of influence, our scope of influence, to lead teaching and learning at whatever level or space or place we want to position ourselves. I hope that's helpful. Long answer, sorry.
Susan, I think you should keep rolling, because we see Karen and Debbie and Gio all have questions, and then Martha in the chat. So let's start with Karen. I propose we take all three questions from Karen, or four, sorry, Karen, Debbie, Gio, and Martha, so that Susan has an opportunity to structure the time. Is that okay for you, Prof?
Yeah, that's fine, but I'm only seeing questions from Martha and Ian.
Yeah.
Are those the ones? Ah, there we go.
Open the mic. And there's Marion's as well. So Karen Wolf, please open your mic, and when you are done, it will be Debbie, and then Gio, and then Prof. Sarah Howie as well. And yes, we recommend you stop sharing screen, Susan. Okay. Can it hear Karen Wolf?
Yes, thanks, Gerda. Susan, thank you so much for that. And your very last comment is in fact connected to what I was going to say to you. that subtle literature in the professional education space at the publication end so often reveals exactly what you're talking about, in the sense that you were talking about, desktop, or you were talking about, the rejections that people experience. And for new educators or academics in the space who are wishing to publish, that can be so, well, humiliating and a whole lot of other things. But the one thing that we've picked up, especially in engineering education literature, is the lack of understanding of so many of the journals about what the space is about. The conflation of terms. You mention maybe a method and they think it's theory. So, the lack of understanding of, a theoretical approach, an analytical approach, a method, and so we have a wealth of journals out there, certainly in the engineering education space, that do not represent the kind of scholarliness that we're talking about. How have you addressed this issue in health sciences education?
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, and I think I'm fortunate in one respect, in that health sciences education, or health professions education, as we more typically refer to it these days, is an established and growing field, actually. And at the moment, the leading health professions education journal internationally actually has a higher impact factor than higher education studies and higher education, which are of the highest impact factor journals in the field of higher education generally. So that already gives one some sort of legitimacy that I was talking about. And I'm aware of the fact that this is true for many other disciplines as well, and is indeed increasing. So I'm a big believer in, if you want to change something, you've got to get your feet wet and your hands dirty. And so how do we change the thinking in these journals? Well, make ourselves available to review for those journals. Join the editorial boards of those journals. Influence the thinking from within. And of course, that does mean that one will have to have done a little bit of the groundwork. But if teaching and learning is your passion, and if you really want to draw on that mantle of being a scholarly teacher who is moving into the field of SOTL, and with a view to even becoming a teaching scholar, then that's going to be part and parcel of the journey. But I do believe we can shift thinking. In my own experience, over the past 10 years, I've just seen how creating opportunities even for staff within my center to become reviewers on international journals, and that catalyzes and it grows, and it, just by being a reviewer on an article that is so clearly UK-centric or US-centric or whatever, and talking back to that, those are the sorts of things that we can do if we insert ourselves into the space. And I mean insert in a nice way, because it's hard work. It's not easy.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Let's hear Debbie and Gio and Sarah. Debbie?
Hi, Susan. So I think my dilemma has been, and I actually I did this as my sole research project, was looking at the SOTL practices inside our engineering faculty. And the thing that I saw the gap was that most people are reflective practitioners, and then they kind of want to move into that scholarly teaching role, but the motivation that they need to give for moving into that scholarly teaching role is the teaching scholar rewards, the outputs that they get once they understand the discourse and they've understood a completely different research field and so on. So my problem at Stellenbosch University is there is this huge chasm between reflective practitioner and teaching scholar. and the scholarly teaching, there's zero reward besides you're kind of in it for the game and you professional development and so on. And most, especially, most lecturers have joined the university because they want to do research in their discipline. And so then when they realize I can't marry my disciplinary research with SOTL or pedagogy unless I basically do a whole other postgraduate learning experience. It took me 10 years to understand my field. It's going to take me 10 years to understand this field and then to marry the two. And then they're just like this, the return on investment is too low and I'm going to step back. So for me, I would really like to see that there's some tangible benefit that lecturers can get besides, giving of their blood, sweat and tears for the benefit of students and the university, some sort of recognition of engaging in that professionalization of your teaching practice. And that's kind of what we were embodying in that teaching and learning policy. But there still seems to be a big gap between these two places.
Yeah,
so I don't know what my question is. Ideas, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, really fantastic that you embarked on that study and explored that issue in such depth, because again, it contributes to our knowing about these issues, and should be, if it's not already doing so, it should be feeding into the institutional debate. I have to say, though, that I do believe contexts differ across the university. And I know, anecdotally and by my own lived experience, that there are contexts where it might not be quite that difficult to get the sort of recognition that you're referring to. And I mean, in my own faculty, I've sat on the academics appointment committee. I've just transitioned off. They kicked me off because I'd now been there for 3 years. And I can tell you, without speaking out of that committee, that teaching and learning is on the agenda in those discussions. And maybe to give you something very tangible, I reported just this past week at our faculty board on issues relating to the status of teaching and learning in the faculty. And I was able to inform the faculty that since the inception of our Masters in Health Professions Education, 22 members of staff, so in other words, people who are mostly discipline-specific lecturers, for want of a better term, have successfully graduated with a Master's in Health Professions Education. I'm not talking about our PhDs, because clearly they've moved into a different space, but these are Masters in Health Professions Education. And at this point in time, we have 24 members of staff who are registered for a Master's in Health Professions Education, which suggests to me that I mean, we're talking, university people are bright people. They have made conscious career decisions. They must feel that there's a reward there. So I think we need to be, as a community, we need to push back against this narrative and change the narrative and create the narrative ourselves that says your research should be informing your teaching across all levels. And maybe I'm being a bit of a Pollyanna now, and I don't want to naysay the challenges. And indeed, in this article that I wrote with colleagues from around the world, it was a discourse. It was an important discourse. But it was also about how do we change that discourse. If we really believe that the decisions we make about our teaching and learning have to be based on evidence, then we have to believe there's a need for us to create that evidence within our own context, so that we are not always drawing on work from elsewhere in the world.
Sorry, Susan, to interrupt. I'm maybe too conscious of time. Let's hear Gio and Prof. Sarah, and there are more questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you for an excellent presentation. So my question goes, I think, back a little bit to Karen's point earlier on, and it's around choosing where to publish your SOTL work, right? And specifically in context perhaps somewhat different from yours. So it would be good to get your reflections on this, where we don't, disciplines where there aren't many journals, or any journals for that matter, focusing on the teaching of the discipline. And for me, the challenge coming from such a discipline has been to decide, should I focus my publications and my output on education, SOTL focused specific journals, or should I be trying to get into the disciplinary journals? And that remains for me a kind of a tension, something that I'm constantly mediating. But I'm wondering whether, in trying to influence both your own discipline, to start thinking around SOTL in the discipline, but also showing the legitimacy of that kind of research within your discipline, whether, trying to get into the disciplinary journals, this kind of research would not be the primary objective. But perhaps it's also one of those, it's not either or, it's both. I don't know, but I would certainly like to hear your reflections on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gio. And yes, I'm afraid you're suffering from the fact that you are a trailblazer in your discipline. And yeah, so you are really pushing boundaries at the moment in terms of challenging and asking these questions. And I think really you gave the answer at the end. I don't think it's going to be either or. I think different pieces of work will have the potential to sell different messages, but also resonate with different audiences. And this is always a bit of a juggle, as you know, as I'm sure just about everyone on the call knows. Academic publishing is a messy place. And so maybe as researchers, we need to look back at ourselves and say, so what am I hoping this particular work will do in terms of taking the science forward? Am I hoping to shift thinking around theory, or am I hoping to shift thinking around practice? Often people might say, well, a little bit of both. I would argue, the one will have to take precedence of the other, and maybe that will guide. But I don't want to try to minimize the challenge that people like yourself in disciplines where there are not that many established journals that have an educational bent. It is going to be difficult, but again, that is, how do we use our agency? How do we advocate for these things? We need to be writing maybe more in like The Conversation and University News International and so on, so that people start hearing it from all sides. I don't know, but I hope it's not an either or.
Thanks, Susan. That the relationship between the disciplines that Gio asked and you responded to is also closely related to Prof. Gedult's question about the grounding our scholarship in our domain and yet be able to pull from general educational knowledge. So if you can maybe link to that, and then we have still promised Prof. Sarah Howie an opportunity to speak. And while we're at it, I also want to thank and welcome Prof. Ram Juggernaut to Auxin. We're very honored that you are here, very welcome among us. And yes, over to Prof. Sarah Howie.
Thank you, and thank you so much. It's been a great presentation and wonderful discussion, and I'm so grateful to be part of it. It reminds me actually some of these comments of the early days of maths and science education when we had similar challenges, and so it's bringing back quite a lot, I have to say. I had a specific question. I really found your idea of the continuum very useful in the thinking in this. And I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about the transitioning between being the tourist to the resident to the citizen, that analogy you drafted in terms of the steps to legitimate participation. And the reason for me asking is perhaps that if some of this can be more explicit in the way that we are communicating with colleagues who are on the outside, so to speak, it may be baby steps towards us bringing more people into the discussion who are feeling a little bit on the outside and unsure. So I wondered if you could just characterize perhaps those three categories that you talked about, if you could say a little bit more, if you have enough time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Hopefully I'll be able to send you the article in the not too distant future. But I mean, I suppose intuitively, and this is perhaps coming from my involvement where I work a lot with emerging researchers on academic writing and how do you get published and all those sorts of ideas. I suppose if we think about the extent of the investment that we're prepared to make in this scholarly journey, in this subtle journey. I published several years ago an article on the complex investments made by PhD students and not money investment, but sort of personal investment, academic investment, professional investment. There's a cost when you do the PhD, and you've got to weigh these costs up and make a decision about the extent to which you want to invest in this journey. And it's also picked up in the work of Margaret Archer, where she looks about, you know, the extent of our agency is linked to the way in which we're prepared to invest in something. And again, not financial. And so I think if we start thinking about the tourist, temporary residents, permanent residents, citizen, it's about the extent of the investment that we're prepared to make. And I haven't thought about quantifying that. So you ask a good question, and maybe that's something I need to think more about. So perhaps not a full answer, but just also pick up on to pick up on what Heike was saying. I mean, I think, Heike, in many ways, you identify a way into SOTL with a slightly different perspective, in that you are grounding your scholarship in your domain and pulling in what we can know from education, that sort of knowing, and develop that understanding into our own domain. So I quite like that point of departure, to say I'm grounded in my field, and I think that's a little bit of what Gia was also referring to, you know, is how we take what we know about our field and think about how people come to know and come to learn in our fields. So I really like that approach.
Thanks,
how we
Susan.
do it is probably another story.
You're tying all the threads together so nicely. I think you're touching on Martha's point, marrying our discipline and SOTL. Does it not perhaps also fluctuate as one goes through a longitudinal journey? So you can consider that one, and maybe you want to add more. But also, Susan, I think the last important question I want to get to until someone else puts their hand up is Prof. Nels. What changes do you think will COVID have on SOTL?
Yeah, trust Ian to come up with a very interesting question. I think COVID-19 has had huge influences on scholarship, full stop. And I sat in on a webinar a while back delivered by a scholar from somewhere in the US in a very, very medical related field, but really on many levels, being quite negative about the scholarship that has been emerging over the past year. So many of you will know that journals have been flooded with submissions, and there's been scholarship of varying quality, and this particular gentleman was really, you know, bewailing the fact that research in areas such as TB and malaria was being left behind in this rush to look at COVID. And teaching and learning has been similarly influenced. You can hardly pick up an article that's been published in the last 10 months that doesn't refer to COVID in some way or another. How it will change subtle is not something I've thought about, Ian. I don't know. Maybe one thing I could say, and this is just off the top of my head now, I have engaged this past years with colleagues and scholars from around the world like never before. And COVID has enabled that, because we have been forced to, instead of getting on an aeroplane, do what we're doing right now. And in a funny way, that has focused on the scholarliness of our conversations, because otherwise I would have been having coffee and lunch conversations with these colleagues who I pick up on. And I might be involved in projects on them, but it's different now, where we really face-to-face grapple with ideas and issues. And of course have the privilege of engaging with specialists from all over the world. So maybe I'll offer that, but I haven't thought about it in detail. Good question.
Thank you, Susan. And I see Prof. Ian is also thanking you for that answer, and Debbie agrees. So I want to thank you, Susan, and I think so many people have, but to us all and to me, it was a really meaningful session. And thank you especially for being able to answer so many of our questions and also put the question back to us in a very constructive way. And I see so many people also thanking you in the chat. Colleagues, as you know, yes, please, Susan, go ahead. Just
sorry,
unmute.
I think I'm unmuted. If I could, I cannot ignore Gert Young's posting, and just in recognition of Johan Dempers. And I know my CTL colleagues from way back, we remember Johan as one of the early adopters and champions for teaching and learning. And Gert is just reminding us that Johan once argued that scholarship about teaching in our disciplines is very much part of our discipline. And teaching a discipline and understanding how students construct knowledge of a discipline is very much part of understanding the discipline itself. So the argument, even though our reality might not suggest otherwise, is that research about teaching and learning in a specific discipline is not separate from our research in our disciplines, and both are concerned with the deep understanding of the discipline. So thank you, Gert. I cannot imagine a better way to close this session. Really appreciate that post.
Thank you, Susan, for that beautiful ending. And then this ongoing discussion about the relationship between our disciplinary research and our social work is also going to be the topic of our next Auxin on 23 March, and it will be Robbie Pott of engineering. He will talk about balancing it. So that was definitely a theme that came out of today. So with that, Susan, really thank you very much. And I think you made such a beautiful ending. Yes, you can unmute. There is a last minute and you can have it.
Just to say thank you and take care and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Susan. Thank you, colleagues, also for the very constructive discussion. Goodbye.